My name is Anna. I did the combined Doctor of Philosophy and Master of Clinical Psychology at the University of Western Australia, and I did quite clinically oriented research, so in suicide prevention. So my research involves looking at loneliness and belongingness as risk factors for suicidal ideation, particularly how these factors change over time to increase and decrease suicide thoughts. Yeah. My project involved 4 studies. 2 of those were experimental studies, so we used an experimental task, and the other 2 were naturalistic observational studies. So the 2 experimental studies involved participants completing a task that was designed to measure 2 factors that we know are related to suicidal thoughts, or to actually more specifically create a desire to escape from a situation. And I guess the usefulness of having that experimental paradigm is that then you get to control for all the extra things, because what goes into creating suicidal thoughts is really complicated, and the cleaner that we can get that image, the easier it is to understand how things influence it. But also in suicide research, experimental studies can only go so far. We need to actually be measuring the things that we're concerned about. So that's why we did the 2 naturalistic studies as well, where we actually measured different suicidal thoughts, different factors that lead to those thoughts, like loneliness and belongingness, as well as protective factors, so things like zest for life and that kind of thing. And we measured them over time. And by comparing the experimental studies with the naturalistic studies, we were able to see if those patterns that we saw in the experimental task were the same or different than the ones that we found in the naturalistic studies. So a naturalistic study involves more observations. So you have participants complete a bunch of questionnaires that are investigating the things that you're interested in. So yeah, we had people completing a scale on loneliness and responding to questions about have they ever thought about suicide, how frequently, that kind of thing. And really that's the extent of it. You just ask them these questions. You don't try and kind of control what other factors might be influencing it, which is obviously why we needed the experimental study for that control. So what we did was have people complete those questionnaires at one time point, and then about 6 weeks later complete those questionnaires again to see how people had just naturally changed over that time. So if you think of the comparison to the experimental study, we deliberately caused a change in some of those factors. So like how people felt like they belonged, we deliberately caused a change in that in the experimental study. Whereas in the naturalistic study, we just let whatever was going to happen and just observed that change. Stretching them as far as they can go, bearing in mind that my research was very theoretical, it's very early on. I guess the really important thing about my research is that a lot of suicide research looks at people at imminent risk of acting out suicidal behaviours, whereas we went for way back and when these thoughts are first starting to emerge. And I guess what we found was that we might be able to intervene at that point before people have even really started to think about hurting themselves, and prevent suicide from even crossing their minds. But that's very far.